Hello, welcome to the Raw podcast. James Copley here from the Sunderland Echo, joined by my colleague Phil Smith. During this international break, Phil, what have you been up to? I feel like I ask you this every international break, and it's getting more difficult to come up with fresh answers.
Yeah, what have I been up to? Not a lot, actually. I am rewatching all the Hobbit and Lord of the Rings films, which I do every year. So that's a bit of a tradition in our house, which has been good. And took the Greyhound to the lakes, my new Greyhound. So that was absolutely glorious, to be fair. No, I've actually quite enjoyed it. And obviously yesterday I was at the Derby at the Stadium of Light, which was it was really frustrating in the end. Fantastic to see 15,000 in the Stadium of Light, obviously. I think I'm hoping that's the start of a really positive chapter in terms of sort of women's football in Sunderland, because it was a great atmosphere. Frustrated that Sunderland, I think they probably deserved a point, and it's not been the start of the season that we were hoping for, but I think we'll be okay. I still have a lot of belief in the quality in that squad, and it's been a pretty tough fixture-wise. It's been a really tough start of the season, so I'm certainly not panicking yet. I still think it could be a good season for the lasses, but yeah, so been busy, to be fair. I don't think you were expecting an answer that long. I think I've done well there.
Yeah, you have done well. Just on the women's side of things, Phil, what do you put this slow start to the season down to? Because there was a couple of exits in the summer. Obviously, Claudia Moan, high profile, going to Newcastle. She played yesterday against her childhood club, but it wasn't really an off-season of flux like it was the season before. I think we all feared the summer before last that Sunderland might struggle. It actually turned out to be the opposite, and there was a real sort of re-energisation of Sunderland, and they obviously went on to do really well in the Championship. This season, it just feels like it's stalled a little bit. I've got full faith in Mel Ray, by the way, who was a ridiculously good operator at this level. I'm sure Sunderland will be fine, but it just feels like that momentum has just stalled a little bit.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. I think there's two elements to it. One is from the Sunderland perspective, and one is, as we always say when we discuss men's, women's academy football, it's about what your rivals are doing as well. And I think what we've seen this summer is, I think we've seen an absolute huge amount of investment into the sort of top 6 clubs probably in the division. And I think already the table is pretty much, apart from one or two exceptions, shout out to Durham, who started the season unbelievably well. I think the table reflects that. And I think that it is difficult at the moment for Sunderland to keep pace with teams like Newcastle, who we all know have invested incredibly heavily in their side. I think Demi Stokes, playing at left back, I thought she was the best player on the pitch yesterday, and that's just where the reality of where Newcastle are at and where Sunderland are at. You look at London City's takeover, who Sunderland actually beat the other week, which was an incredible result, the investment and the calibre of player they're signing. I do think there's, an element of concern about Sunderland competing with these teams. The other side of it is not to panic. It has been a really, really, really tough fixture list to start. And I think if you look at the fixtures around sort of November and December, I expect Sunderland to pick up points. I think that quite a few of the players in the team at the moment just aren't quite yet at the level that they were last season. I think that's a fair comment. But I'm genuinely not got any huge concerns. I expect Sunderland to pull away from the bottom. I expect them to pick up results. I think they've got a decent squad. I don't think at the moment they're a top 4-5 team in this league because of the money that's been spent by other clubs. And in the long run, that's a big sort of question and a task for the ownership, really, as to whether they can find the resource or whether they'll commit the resource, to push them. And obviously, we want both sides of the club to be sustainable. But there is obviously going to be a challenge competing with these teams in the long run. But I'm not panicking about the results so far. It's been a tough fixture list. Apart from the opening day of the season, which, by the team's own admission was a bit of a shambles, they've been competitive in most games. I do think they'll finish mid-table.
Absolutely. Full coverage of the women's side of things over at the Sunderland Echo website. Phil was at the game and produced a live blog if you want to catch up with anything, and also some player ratings as well, and reaction from Mel Ray. So head over to the website for all of that good stuff. We're going to have a little look at Sunderland's 9-game championship season so far. We're going to do things as we always do this time of year. Our highlights, our lowlights, biggest frustrations, best player, best young player we'd like to see more of, all of that good stuff. But we're going to start on a couple of newsy items first as well. Jordan Henderson, Phil, being linked with a return to Sunderland or the Championship or the Premier League, depending on which reports you read. He's over in Ajax at the moment, obviously had that high-profile move to Saudi Arabia. I think there's a lot to say about this. Where are you sort of with it at the moment in terms of Jordan Henderson to Sunderland?
Yeah, I pleaded with you not to discuss this on the podcast this morning because I think it's such a big topic and one that I have very mixed emotions on. I think, listen, 2 years ago, it would have been like a dream for all of us, I think, as Sunderland fans, wouldn't it? I think that ultimately, from my perspective, I do think from a footballing perspective, this is basically, it's still a bit of a no-brainer for me. I do genuinely think that. I don't put it in the same category, for example, as Jermaine Defoe, who Defoe hadn't played. He'd been pretty much out in the cold at Rangers. And we saw very quickly when he arrived here that, it was going to take a long time to get up to full fitness. And as it happened, he didn't feel that was going to be possible. And so he retired. And that all ended up being a bit of a shambles. Henderson ultimately has been playing at a pretty decent level. I know he's not in Ajax's starting 11 every week, which is why these reports, it's kind of been floated, I think, to see if there's interest to bring him back to the Premier League or the top of the Championship. I think that, physically he will be at a decent level. I think, we all know the way he looks after himself as well and the professionalism he has. So I think he can contribute. I have to say, hand on heart, I think it would be unbelievable for players like Dan Neil, Joe Bellingham, Chris Rigg to have Jordan Henderson around. I don't think he's the kind of player where it's going to be an issue if he's not playing 90 minutes 3 times a week. I think he would have that maturity and that professionalism to accept the role that he would have in the side and the squad. I think the players would learn so much off him. And I think it would be good. I strongly imagine he has coaching / management ambitions himself. And I think that would be a natural sort of halfway house, if you like. So personally, I think from a football perspective, I think it would be a good thing. The big thing that's changed from when I started to make my point there from a couple of years ago is that I think it would leave, people would be uncomfortable about it because, some Sunderland fans will be listening to this saying they don't care that he went and played in Saudi Arabia. They're not bothered. His decision, his career, which I respect. And a lot of fans will probably be saying, well, hang on, I've criticised what's happened up the road at my local rivals and said that I don't think that's right. And therefore, I have to say that, I disagree with the decision that Jordan Henderson made. Personally, I'll never be able to understand that decision to go and play in Saudi Arabia at that stage of his career. It'll never make sense to me. And so that leaves me with, I would share the sort of the reservations of Sunderland supporters while respecting that, everyone has the right to do what they want with their life and their career. I suspect that won't be an issue for Sunderland. Remember that they played a friendly against the Saudi Arabian team during the winter break when the World Cup was held in winter. So I really don't think that the ownership will be having any reservations about that side of things if they feel a deal is possible. So I think, and from a footballing perspective, I would say that I think this would be more beneficial than problematic. But I do think that the whole mood has changed a lot, really, from when we may have been discussing this 2 years ago, saying it was a dream scenario. And I certainly understand why some Sunderland fans aren't sure about it. We ran a poll, didn't we, a couple of weeks ago on the Echo site, and I think it was about 60% in favour. And that seems about right. I think there will be a lot of people who feel uncomfortable with it, but still respect what Henderson's done in his career. A lot of people who are just in favour of it and aren't really bothered by the decision he made to go and play in Saudi Arabia. Some people who, footballing reasons, will have concerns. Yeah, it's a really, really tricky one, really. A lot of mixed emotions, I think.
It's a really tough landscape and a really tough argument, isn't it? Just that general topic of Saudi influence in sport, because we've just had Riyadh season in boxing, there's Live Golf, there's sort of Saudi Arabian dealings with the United Kingdom government, there's links to the British royal family, all of that sort of stuff. So it doesn't feel like any aspect of life is sort of immune to it. Whether or not you agree with it is another matter. And I think what stung really about Jordan Henderson's move to Saudi Arabia was that he had put himself out there as a champion for gay rights, and that move was sort of very much at odds with that, and that's coming from somebody who's not a member of that community. So I can't imagine really what that would have felt like for some people. I think he was badly advised. I think he made a bad decision. The interviews afterwards that he did, I think there was an excellent one in The Athletic with Adam Crafton. I think it did start to dawn on him, what had occurred, and perhaps that he'd let a lot of people down. It almost feels, Phil, a little bit like, in terms of Jordan Henderson, the man, Jordan Henderson, the player, that this potential move to Sunderland, I mean, God knows whether it'll happen or not, almost like he needs it to rehabilitate his career in a sense, and rehabilitate his image, to just go somewhere for the love of it. I'm sure he would be paid by Sunderland, quite well, obviously, but let's not beat around the bush. It would likely be a pay cut from Ajax, and it would definitely be a pay cut from what he was receiving at Liverpool and Saudi Arabia, to go somewhere to finish his career at the club where it started, to potentially help lift them to the Premier League, to become that sort of ambassador to Chris Rigg or Joe Bellingham, and Dan Neil as well. It feels like he could really use that. Whether you agree that should happen or not is a different matter. But in terms of Jordan Henderson, it feels like he could really do with that in terms of his career.
I think it works better than the Defoe thing did, for all the reasons that I said. I think it would be, I can see the real positives for Henderson in this, in terms of maybe his future coach and managerial career. I still suspect he would be able to contribute a fair amount on the pitch at this level. We've talked for about 18 months, 2 years about someone not having enough experience and depth. So we probably can't sit here and say, "Oh, don't go out and get Jordan Henderson," with the titles he's won and what have you. So I think, like, if you were just saying from a pure football perspective, like, I suspect it'll be very difficult for someone to do for the financial reasons you've just outlined. Yeah. I think if he was available, would there be a Premier League side towards the bottom who would think, what an opportunity to get a player of his professionalism and attitude in to boost morale around the place? I find it very difficult to see someone actually getting it over the line, to be honest. From a football perspective, I'm in favour. I still think, that decision he made to go to Saudi Arabia, while I respect it from it's not my place to tell anyone what they should and shouldn't do with their lives, and it's a short career for a footballer. I still feel ultimately that's kind of unresolved, if you like, and so I can understand why there would some fans would have reservations about it, and I think realistically, it would be something that maybe we have to resolve. If he did come back, and so that's kind of where I feel about it. I'm not as comfortable with it as I would have been once upon a time, when I would have been very excited about it. I do think if Sunderland were able to pull it off, and that's a huge if, I can't stress that enough, really. I think football-wise it would be beneficial. I would do it, but I do still think that decision, is left a sour taste for a lot of people, which I completely understand, and I think that would leave some. Yeah, I think that's still unresolved. I think that's the best way to put it.
We won't dwell on this topic too much longer, because we want to get into the season review. But you mentioned comparisons to Defoe there, and this is me strictly playing devil's advocate. Devil's advocate, devil's dick advocate, I was going to say there. But we'll use that. We'll start coining that term. Actually, that's better than the original. So just to present the flip side to the argument in terms of the football side, and I'm not saying I necessarily agree with this, but you mentioned the comparison with Defoe. The comparison my mind would go back to would maybe be Grant Ledbetter. Obviously, Jordan Henderson, undoubtedly a better player than Grant Ledbetter. But Grant Ledbetter came to Sunderland, and yes, the landscape is shifted slightly at Sunderland. They're in a different division. He came at around 34, 35 from memory. And, I was over the moon with that signing, but in hindsight, which is always 2020, is that the sort of signing that Sunderland needed? Sunderland's midfield seemed to do a little bit better after Grant Ledbetter left, and I'm loath to sort of present that point of view, because I'm a massive, huge Grant Ledbetter fan, and I got caught up in the emotion of that move like everybody else. And he undoubtedly contributed for Sunderland on the field as well. I mean, the respect I have towards him for playing so soon after a bereavement in the playoff semi-final against Portsmouth is incredible. But the point I'm making is, from a football perspective, does Henderson signing slightly block Sunderland's exciting midfield options? And is there a comparison maybe to Ledbetter in terms of, yes, hindsight's always 2020, but it does fill your squad up as well?
Yeah, I think. Well, the one thing it says we have no idea by the time January rolls around where Salis Abdul Samad is going to be. So he's yet to kick a ball. All the indications from before the international break from Regis Lebris were that he wasn't going to be ready for this weekend. If he's not ready to return this weekend, there has to be a question about how many games he's going to play before the November international break. Now, if he comes back after the November international break and he's playing regularly and contributes over the festive period, and there is a precedent for that, because if you remember, Mishu barely kicked a ball before kind of November, December time, and then was a really good player. So, but I think that's a big question, because if Samed's playing regularly and contributing, if Rigg, Bellingham, Brown, and Neil are all still fit, then there probably isn't a huge gap for a player of Henderson's sort of profile. Now, if Samed cannot get fit for whatever reason, if he can't get past these injury issues, I'm not saying that'll happen, you just don't know, then there's definitely a role for Henderson, isn't there? Because we've seen at the moment that the 4 players are playing a huge amount of minutes and that there's not a lot of variety for an alternative to Dan in that holding midfield position. So I think that's one thing to watch. The difference with Ledbetter, I actually think Ledbetter, in a lot of ways, was a good sign. I think he contributed a lot. I thought his performances were good. He scored a lot of important goals and he played a part. Ledbetter could have been a brilliant signing if Sunderland's other midfield options were like Job, Dan, if he had legs around him, if he had the players who could do the things that at that stage of his career he couldn't do. I think probably the argument you could make for at the time when Ledbetter came back was that you already had Catmull there. And so maybe you didn't have kind of the right blend in midfield, rather than necessarily it being an issue with Ledbetter. I think Ledbetter showed in his performances and what he brought off the pitch on and off, as well as on it, that he still had a lot to contribute. So that's why, Ledbetter and Defoe, I think this is slightly different, because what you're doing is you're adding something different to a successful formula. And I think that should be a positive, whereas Defoe and Ledbetter were used as the answer really to parts of the pitch where at the time Sunderland were failing, and they were realistically never going to be dancing by themselves. If Henderson's wouldn't be coming as, the kind of saviour of Sunderland's midfield. So that's where I view it slightly differently on that point. I do think a lot would rest on Samed. If Samed's playing fit and he's in form, then you start to look a little bit more and go, well, hang on, do we need Henderson? Is he going to play much at all? In which case, is that going to be a good thing to bring him back? So I do think there's a lot of time between now and January, personally, and I think one of the interesting things moving forward is going to be Samed.
Nicely put, Phil. Nicely put. Right, we're going to move on from the Jordan Henderson chatter, and we're going to look at our little mini review of Sunderland's season so far. Obviously, 9 games in, Sunderland top of the league. We're going to run through our highlight of the season so far, our biggest frustration, our favourite goal, our player of the season so far, our young player of the season so far, the player or players we would like to see more of, and mark out of 10. We'll run through Phil, we'll run through myself, and then we'll also get some of your thoughts from social media. So, Phil, we will start on the highlight for you during Sunderland's season so far.
Yeah, it was funny doing this, because initially because it was the most recent one, my sort of head went straight to obviously Melior's error and the scenes inside the stadium, right? But I can't put that one forward, because obviously my experience as a journalist is completely different to the fans, and the Wi-Fi wasn't working very well that night in the stadium, and that was just absolute chaos. I couldn't get connected. I was trying. Obviously, a goal that late meant that I had to rewrite my match report. I was trying to work out what had actually happened so you can sort of report it accurately. It was just total chaos. Actually, it wasn't until I got home and I poured a little whiskey and I actually sat and watched it back, and I saw all the limbs in the stadium. And I saw the celebration with the players and the fans. It actually took me that bit of time to sort of actually appreciate what had happened and sort of enjoy it, really. So I don't think I can put that one forward. So I think I would probably have to go for the Sheffield Wednesday game. I think, the first half there where someone just completely ran amok. Because I think it's easy now to, in hindsight, you remember that it hadn't been very long ago that Sheffield had completely turned Sunderland over on the final day of the season. We all came into that game thinking Sheffield were going to be a really, really tough opponent. Sunderland had won their opening day of the season against Cardiff, which was a great result, but they hadn't played brilliantly. So I don't think we came away thinking, wow, we've really seen the start of something here. So for Sunderland to go toe-to-toe, be really brave with how they pressed in that game against the side who we all thought were going to be a really tough opponent, and just completely blow them away in the first half an hour, really, was absolutely just exhilarating. And I still think that was the most exciting sort of thing I've seen this season. I think the other thing, I would chuck in there would be Mundell's goal against Burnley in terms of a highlight, just because I think, we fretted for the best part of the year really about Jack Clarke going, and the fact that he would go and then the next day pretty much, a young lad would just take his place and just score this brilliant goal and just put in a brilliant performance against Burnley. I thought that was amazing. But I think on balance, I would go for that first sort of half an hour against Sheffield, because it just felt like we were turning the page on what had been a pretty rubbish sort of 2024 until that point.
Yeah, that Meslier howler was good. I was sharing the frustrations with the Wi-Fi around that time. I didn't have as much to do on the final whistle as you, and as such, sort of nearly broke the golden rule of the press box, which is don't celebrate, because it was so unexpected that it was like and I sort of had to catch myself and return to work. I actually had, for this one, Phil, Burnley. I was really, really pleased with the Burnley performance, and I think the way Sunderland ground that out towards the end, obviously with Dan Neil getting sent off late on, you sort of feared that there could be a late equaliser coming after that moment, but Sunderland controlled that really well. And that was the first time during the season so far, Phil, that we sort of looked at each other and went, hang on a minute, I think there might be a team here. So that for me was a hugely pleasing sort of moment, was that final whistle against Burnley.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, as I was saying there, the Mundell thing was a big part of that, wasn't it? And what he's done this season has just been incredible so far. So, yeah, I think generally you could expand that and just say the home form has been a real tonic this season. I think it's something that we've kind of been frustrated with for a long time, really, with Sunderland, is they haven't really made the stadium like that kind of fortress, if you think, and it hasn't been the asset that it should be to the team, really. And I think that, what Lebris has done has been really impressive, and that he's harnessed the crowd in that first half an hour, against Sheffield Wednesday, just completely blown away. At times, we've been really aggressive, pressed really high, and really got the crowd behind the team. But he's been flexible about it as well, and he hasn't maybe fallen the traps of the past of, he's been happy at times to say, well, look, one of the things problems we've had at times is breaking down the low block at home. And there's been times where he's invited the opposition onto Sunderland, hasn't he? And sort of added another string to Sunderland's attacking ball that way. So I think more broadly, the fact that you turn up at the Stadium of Light and kind of Sunderland have consistently produced some good performances, I think that's a big, big turnaround from where we were last year.
Absolutely. Let's head to social media. Jordan Ramsey says his highlight was the first 25 minutes against Sheffield Wednesday. I mean, that was superb, being 3-0 up. It was brilliant, as you mentioned, Phil. Stuart Tench says Sheffield Wednesday first half battering as well. Michael Bowers agrees with us both. He says Burnley, Clark Sale happened around that game, obviously with Mundell's goals as well. Ethan Todd references the Sheffield Wednesday first half as well. Nick Wilson says the Burnley performance. Michael Dunn agrees, and he says that the home form generally. And Matthew Powell says the overall team performance generally during this season as well. So we will move on to the second category. Phil, biggest frustration. I have a couple for this. I think obviously the Plymouth and Watford games, sort of, given the performance levels, feel like Sunderland could have got something out of both of those games. And then for me as well, the big one, the injuries to Ballard and Elise in particular as well, who had started the season so brightly.
Yeah.
That's been sort of offset by the arrival of Chris Mepham in his form and the form of Luke O'Nien actually as well, who I'm sure we'll come on to later on. But I really felt like something good was starting to happen with Elise as well. To be ruled out until the November international break is a shame. Credit to Sunderland for planning around that, and obviously Mepham's come in. But no less good for him as well. And I think he's a player we all like as well. I think he's a person we all like as well.
Yeah, I think that's a great shout. And I would go with Elise's injury as well, because I think that, it was actually exciting to see how quickly he was developing, because we haven't really seen him play much at centre-half. And I think in pre-season, it was like he was doing okay, but, he didn't look 100% comfortable. And then he was just getting better and better. And by the time he got his injury, he was playing at like an incredibly exciting high level, I think. And Lebris even, he remarked in one of his press conferences about how much Elise was developing from game to game and how much he was beginning to understand what Lebris wanted for him. I think you could chuck, although it's very different to Elise, I think you could chuck Poveda in there. Like, we all knew it was a bit of a gamble because he'd missed a lot of football in the past. But at the same time, he'd finished the season really well with Sheffield, and he seemed like quite an exciting signing in a lot of ways. So I think his persistent injuries have been a real frustration, and the fact that realistically, I don't think we're going to see him until after the November international break, certainly not in a significant way. I would chuck that in there. But I think probably the main one I would go for is the Watford game, because I just thought, by and large, that was such a rubbish performance. The Plymouth one was like frustrating, but Plymouth played well. They had a real goal. Sissoko was brilliant for them. And if you actually look at what Plymouth have done since, they've been really good at home. So that one is kind of one of those where on another day, someone would have won at 3-2. On this day, they lost at 3-2. I was kind of at peace with that one. Watford, I just didn't think they turned up. And I know that, yes, okay, it was 1-1 when Dan Neil gave the foul away, and that's what drew the headlines. But Sunderland didn't turn up in that game. They could have been 2-3-0 behind in the first half an hour. They did rally a bit to equalise and then play quite well in the second half. But I just thought that was a game they totally let pass them by. And that was a real frustration for me. That's the one, like, when I was doing these categories kind of thing, that just came straight in my head, because that was just such a disappointing afternoon. I think you can, away from home, I think you can lose games like the Plymouth one. I think it happens. The Watford one was just such a, just for me, like, just such an all-round sort of disappointing performance.
Absolutely. Matthew Powell agrees on social media. His biggest frustration is dropping silly points away from home. Michael Dunn says his was conceding late at Plymouth and Watford. Agree with that. Nick Wilson dropping points late in 2 away games. An account called Savoury Dip, which is a great name for a Twitter account, says his biggest frustration was losing to Plymouth. Ethan Todd agrees, says the Plymouth loss. Michael Bowers concurs, says late errors against Plymouth and Watford. Stu Tench as well, switching off against Plymouth. So yeah, a lot of frustration around those Plymouth and Watford games, but probably actually a sort of a testament to how high Sunderland have set the standards in these opening 9 games as well, I would say. But let's move on to the next category. Favourite goal, Phil. There are a couple of contenders, but mine's pretty set in stone. I'll let you go first on this one.
Well, I know which one you're going to go for, and it's totally fair, so I'll go for the other one. I'm going to go with Job against Derby, because I just thought that was such a sweet... I love those goals where the moment it leaves his foot, it's just not going anywhere other than the top corner. And I just thought... And that was exactly as well, because that was shaping up the kind of game where sometimes Sunderland have come up short in the last couple of years, where they've dropped points midweek at home to teams who, inverted commas, Sunderland should be beaten, and Sunderland started that game quite poorly, didn't they? And you just kind of go, oh, is this going to be one of those nights? And I think for him just to produce a goal of that quality, and it was just aesthetically so pleasing, picks it up, and you have that little moment of, go on then, and then he hits it, and it's just
I think the most pleasing thing for me about that goal, obviously the strike was class, but it was the shoot from the stadium of light crowd as well. That seldom goes right, does it? When you tell a player to shoot and he doesn't, it flies in the top corner.
Yeah, that was just great. So I know I'll let you take over, because I know what you're going to say, and that is obviously the shout. But I wanted to show some love to that goal because I thought that was I just thought that was glorious.
Yeah, I think you could split it off into 2 categories, could you? You could have best screamer and then best goal generally. But for me, the best goal generally, in terms of feeling, it was pretty aesthetically pleasing as well. The audacity, the skill, the stage on which he did it as well. It was a big game. It's got to be Chris Ring against Middlesbrough, 17 years old, to do that in a local rivalry. I'll say not a derby, because we'll get told off for that. But just magnificent, and a real sort of. Is it a coming of age moment? He's probably already come of age, hasn't he, over the recent sort of seasons? But yeah, really, really breathtaking. And I don't think television actually did it justice of how tight that angle was. It was superb, a great moment, and a great to beat Middlesbrough at the Stadium of Light as well, just for fans generally.
Yeah, I think so. I think that is the goal of the season so far. I think we could box that one off. I think that would be like a 99% winner, but I thought I would show Job some love as well for that goal.
No, absolutely. Jordan Ramsey says Rig versus Borough. Stu Tench says Job versus Derby. Michael Bauer says Riggs audacious back heel. Ethan Todd agrees with the back heel as well. Savoury Dip says Bellingham versus Derby. Nick Wilson says Mundell versus Burnley, which we covered a little bit, which is a great shout as well. Michael Dunn versus Borough. Matthew Powell comes up with a little bit of a different one, Phil, and probably a little bit under the radar, but Mayenda versus Sheffield Wednesday as well. To see him get that goal after his performances in pre-season, to see a Sunderland striker scoring at the Stadium of Light, and I guess actually you could combine that with a little bit of a disappointment that Mayenda's sort of momentum was halted by that injury as well. Could be a bit of a low light.
Yeah, I think so. I really like that. Actually, it's a really good point because, and I think credit to Mayenda and Isidore that we didn't do a 20-minute thing in the low light section about strikers, because actually Sunderland have got the right amount of goals really from the centre forwards that you would expect, and I think that Mayenda did an excellent job really in the opening weeks of the season. I'm not too concerned. I think that realistically, if you look at his workload in the opening weeks of the season compared to what it was in the past 18 months, I think little injuries were inevitable because the kind of the surge in his workload is through the roof really. And actually, to be honest, I think even if he hadn't picked up a little injury, I think it might have been time to rotate a little bit anyway. I don't see any harm in that. We've got to remember that Mayenda's, I don't think, is he 20 yet? I'm not sure he is. So he's never going to play 46 games anyway. And I think to be in a position where you can roll Isidore in and what he's done, I think is a really exciting one. But yeah, I'm really pleased someone's shown a little bit of love to Mayenda because that was one of the biggest positives the first 3-4 weeks of the season. Testament to Labrise for the work he did with him in pre-season and for trusting him as well. Not looking at what had happened in the previous year, but just going on what he'd seen in training and going with what he was kind of seeing from Mayenda, but also clearly to Mayenda because a huge improvement in a very short space of time.
Yeah, Mayenda isn't 20 until the 8th of May, which is quite frankly ridiculous.
That's incredible. It's incredible. if he was a Sunderland Academy product, we'd be tripping over ourselves in excitement. So yeah, that's amazing.
Yeah, that is crazy. That's blown my mind a bit, actually. Right, we'll move on to the next category. Let me just find my notes here. So, yes, we're looking at player of the season so far. I'll start on this, if you don't mind, Phil. I'm going to go for the very obvious shout, I think, anyway, of Luke O'Nien. I think he's reacted really well. Obviously, Dan Neil's had the team captaincy, so he's sort of had the armband taken off him, but hasn't really. He's still club captain. He's played, I think, 90 minutes in all of Sunderland's games. He's got 2 goals, 1 assist. I think Sunderland have kept 5 clean sheets, is it, in the opening 9 games of the season. I think his levels at centre-back have improved again this season to what they were last season. I just think without Luke O'Nien, I'm not sure Sunderland go on that run. I think his experience is invaluable. I think he's proved a lot of the doubters wrong, and I think he's the obvious pick for me. I think there are some other players as well, because obviously Sunderland have had a good start of the season, but him being that constant at centre-back as well, there's been a little bit of churn and change. He's had to play with Mepham, he's had to play with Ballard, he's had to play with Elise. I say I had to play with them as if this is that it's sort of a bad thing because they're 3 quality centre-backs as well, but he's had that little inconsistency as well in terms of the personnel next to him. So I think O'Nien is the obvious shout.
Yeah, I don't disagree with any of that. This was one of the easiest categories where I wrote the answer down straight away, and it wasn't O'Nien. I put Dennis Serkin without even thinking.
Actually, yeah, that is a great shout.
I think the left back was arguably, other than the striker, someone's weakest position last season. I think that Serkin has been outstanding in just about every single game, defence and attack. And I think also the thing with Serkin is, sometimes we've talked about this on the pod, haven't we, when valuing players and stuff, and that we live in a bit of the Sunderland bubble and we have rose-tinted glasses for Sunderland players. But with Serkin, it's not just that he looks like he's playing well to us. If you look at the sort of statistics, he is, interceptions, tackles, dribbles. He is right up. I think he's up there with the most fouled players across the entire division. I think he's been outstanding. And we're right to praise Mundell, who's been unbelievable. But to play in front of a defender, in front of a left back who was contributing so much in both phases of the game makes a massive difference. I honestly think he's been exceptional, and he was the one who my mind went straight to, because it's gone from arguably Sunderland's weakest position last season, maybe other than the striker, to probably their strongest position so far this season. I love watching him play. I love his attitude. I think his personality is great. For me, I think he's been exceptional.
Yeah, no, absolutely. O'Nien and Serkin probably the standout candidates. Perhaps Serkin just nicking it as I think about it. I think for me, Phil, the third player in that player of the season conversation, but you could also drop in a young player just based on the consistency of his performances, would actually be Romain Mundle as well. I think he's a contender.
Yeah, I think there's two other players who I think could also be considered for young player of the season as well. Job, yeah, I think Job's been amazing. We'll just fall straight into it because it's easiest. I would give Job my young player of the season so far. I think that obviously Rig would be a strong contender for that because he's been brilliant. But I think Job has been one of the best midfielders in the Championship so far this season. I think you forget that he's still only 18 and in his second full season of professional football. I think just because he looks and moves and talks like a 25-year-old doesn't change the fact that he's actually 18. And I think if you're looking sort of, for the player who I think has been most important to the side, a young player, I think Job would be the one for me. I think Mundle's a really good shout because I think, as I said, we kind of talked about it earlier in the podcast, but Mundle that was the thing that we were most worried about coming into the season when we were making our predictions and stuff. We were all saying, well, I think the squad's, I think there's a lot of positives, but what if Clark goes, what if? And we've barely mentioned Clark's name since he left. And that's absolutely no disrespect to Clark. He was an amazing player for Sunderland. We loved watching him. We wish him all the best in the Premier League. But we all kind of thought we'd be talking every week about going, no Clark. And it's just not happened because Mundle he's produced consistently in the final third. He's a real grafter as well, which obviously we didn't know much about Mundle's game before he arrived. So we didn't know what he was going to be like as a player. But he puts in such a shift. He scraps a bit as well, which, let's be honest, we all love in a Sunderland player. We like to see it. I think he's been fantastic. But yeah, I think Job is performing with a quite incredible level of consistency for his age. And I think just because, I don't know, maybe we don't always remember how young he actually is just because he feels like he's been around for a little bit longer. But I think for me, he would be my young player of the season so far.
Yeah, good shouts again. Matthew Powell, young player of the season, says Rig. His player of the season is Job. Michael Dunn has exactly the same, and so does Nick Wilson on social media as well, as does Savoury Dip. So that is a very there's a bit of a consensus there developing. Let's have a little look. What does Michael Bowers say? His player of the season is Mundle, young player of the season, Bellingham. Stu Tench, player of the season so far, Job, young player, Rig. Jordan Ramsey goes with a Job Rig double as well. And yeah, again, testament to the levels that Sunderland have set, that there are multiple options for both of those 9-game season awards, if that's what we're calling it. Right, what's the next? This is my favourite category, actually. I always like talking about this one. Player you would want to see more of, Phil. Fire away.
Yeah, I actually put 3 down for this. The one I'll go with is Tommy Watson, just because I think we've obviously watched him a lot in the under-21s and just a bit of a cheat code, a bit like Clark was last season. Picks up the ball, beats 2 players, sticks it in the bottom corner. Just seems to be able to do it every time. And actually, what was really exciting is we haven't seen loads of him in the first team, and he hasn't got that big sort of headline in terms of a goal or an assist yet. But he looks like he can do pretty much the same Championship level. He just glides with the ball and he just goes past players. And I really think he's the next big sort of Sunderland Academy graduate. I think he can do what Rig has done. I think especially now with Pavada's injury, I think the door is a little bit open for him and I expect him to take it. And I'm just incredibly excited about what he's going to do. The other 2 obvious ones are Sanchez, because we've talked for years about wanting to see that sort of midfield player, that different midfield player. I'm hoping it can be him. It's incredibly frustrating that at the moment he can't seem to get out on the pitch. Hopefully that'll change. And I'm increasingly intrigued, excited, hopeful about Aaron Connolly, I think. Obviously the interview that he did with the club last week, which everyone will have seen, I thought was remarkable, really, in how honest he was, how accountable he was, and how driven he came across as well. And, by all indications, he produced a very good performance in the 21s last week. Lebreese has been talking a lot about what excellent shape he's in and how impressed he is. If Sunderland are getting sort of the player who came through at Brighton, and that could be a game changer for this squad, really, in terms of his goal record and his pressing as well. So I've chucked 3 in there. I'll go with Watson, but it's going to be one of the interesting things over the next few weeks is to see Connolly. I think I think people are rightly starting to get excited about what he might be able to bring to the table now.
Yeah, I can't disagree with any of that. I had 4 written down. I had Connolly, Samed, Watson, and obviously Abdullahi as well. Obviously, we haven't seen anything of him yet. And then just thinking as well, Alexic is a really bright talent. Sunderland have paid
Yeah,
a
that's
lot
a
of
good
money for
shout.
him.
Yeah.
And one of the ones actually which came through on social media was sort of Alan Brown starting for a good 5-10 games in a row. He's sort of been in and out due to injury, but
Yeah.
what I've seen of Brown has been really impressive, actually.
Yeah, I think that's a really good shout. The only reason I didn't really think of Brown was because he's had a contribution, hasn't he? Fairly significant one. But I think it's a really
2
good shout. I
bizarre
think
goals.
Alexic is a really Alexic is a really interesting one because the problem. I say problem. It's not really a problem. Obviously he's going on international duty, which is really exciting for a player of his age to be playing for a very, very good international side and going away regularly. But it is definitely stopping him sort of really kicking on here at Sunderland because obviously he's trying to learn a new language, he's trying to settle into training, he's trying to understand the new philosophy. These would be the moments where he's getting a 2-week solid training block where he can really make some headway. And obviously he goes off on international duty. So it's a bit of a conundrum that I think a little bit. I'm not saying it's the wrong thing to do because you can't not have a player going, especially at his age, go and represent his country. It's an amazing honour and it'll be good for his development in the long run. But I do feel like that's going to be stop-start for a little bit longer. Like I don't think he's going to be ready to start at Hull or anything like that. Do you know what I mean? I think that's a little bit more of a slow burner. But yeah, I think it's a really good shout. I think he is a real unknown, isn't he? And it's going to be exciting to see what he can bring when the time does come.
I would actually throw into that as well. Like Mayenda starting again when he comes back. I've seen enough from him now to be quite excited to see more. Wilson Isidor's two performances as well, where he's got those 2 goals. Looking forward to seeing more of him. Let's move on to the tail end of the podcast. We're going to do a mark out of 10, nice and simple. Phil, for Sunderland's season so far, I went with a 9. So deducting 0.5 for the performances against Watford and Plymouth, or should I say the result against Plymouth rather. That for me really has been the only sort of mitigating factor in what's been a decent start of the season so far.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I went with an 8, just because I think that, not just because of the Plymouth and Watford things. I think I've got a bit of analysis, which will be up on the website fairly soon, actually, just about sort of performance levels. And I don't think Sunderland have been as good in the last 5 games as they were in the opening 4. That's not like a major criticism. They've got 7 points, which is a decent return, but I do think we've seen a little bit of a drop off and a little bit more inconsistency in the performance levels. It's going to be really interesting to see how Lebris kind of adapts. I think we've definitely seen signs in the last few games, Plymouth, Watford, Leeds, even Derby at times. Teams are starting to find and adapt and find ways to sort of hurt Sunderland a little bit, which is to be expected. That's how football works. So I'm really excited and interested to see how Lebris tries to adapt to that and what kind of Sunderland side we see in the next 5 to 6 games. It's also been a little bit of a frustration that I think that, consistently in games, Lebris hasn't really had the option to turn to the bench. I think for all those players that we've just listed that we want to see more of, there's been different factors in each one, but it does feel like opposition has the advantage in the last 15, 20 minutes of games consistently at the moment because Lebris just doesn't really have those options to change it. That all sounds really negative. I don't mean to be. It's been a better start of the season that I could possibly have envisaged or possibly have hoped for. I think there's loads of really, really good signs, really encouraging. I think the way that Lebris has managed to sort of, in his own way, connect with the supporters, I think it's been really, really good. I've enjoyed watching the vast majority of the game. So 8 out of 10 for me, excellent. Surpassed my expectations, and hopefully now can sort of kick on from here. But I do think there's a lot of work to be done before we can start talking about Sunderland as the finished article.
Yeah, absolutely. Cracking, Phil. Thank you for that. Thank you to the listener for listening to the Raw podcast. We will be back for the Hull City game and then Luton following that as well. Full coverage, full build-up. Regis Lebris's press conference will be at some point as well. I'm guessing Thursday. So keep in touch with Phil's social media and the Sunderland Echo social media for all of the latest team news and injury updates. Thank you for joining us. We'll see you next time.